Hello, and welcome to the virtual Scandinavia House and today's book talk, The Memory Theater by the Swedish author Karin Tidbeck. I would like to thank the book's publishers, Pantheon Knopf Doubleday, for helping us make this event possible. The book is on sale now today and can be purchased through bookshop.org, a website that helps support local bookstores. You are also welcome to ask questions in the chat function located at the bottom of the Zoom. There'll be time at the end of the conversation to have those questions asked. So Karin Tidbeck lives in Malmö, Sweden, where they work as a translator and creating writing teacher. She writes fiction in Swedish and English. Their English language debut, the short story collection Jagannath, received the IAFA William L. Crawford Fantasy Award. Jagannath also was shortlisted for the World Fantasy Award. They are also the author of the novel Amatka. And moderating today's discussion is Sara Lefkowitz. Is a writer and a musician whose childhood love of science fiction and fantasy followed her into adulthood and pervaded all of her creative mediums. So please welcome Karin and Sara.
Hello.
Hi.
It's very nice to meet you. As I was just saying before we started, I absolutely adored the book. It's just this wonderful, magical journey, very like sort of a dark fairy tale. I thought we could start by you just talking about generally what it's about.
Oh, sure. And thank you for being so nice about my book. No, this is a story about two best friends, or siblings really, Dora and Thistle, and their nemesis, Augusta Prima, and the way they make their way around the multiverse. And I will preface this by saying that I am absolutely terrible about talking about my books.
You're doing great.
Stuff happens.
Yeah, yes, many things happen.
Yes, they go on adventures.
Yeah, it's actually interesting. You know, the first thing you mentioned was you said siblings basically, and I thought this was like one of the first themes I really noticed. Is you talk about family in a variety of ways. You know, both actual family and chosen family. And your characters sort of, I don't think there's a value judgment on either one, but there's definitely a distinction of the characters who choose each other as siblings and the characters who, you know, how they deal with their actual families and things. Do you want to expound on that maybe?
Oh, sure. Let me think for a bit.
Mm-hmm.
I think chosen families is something that sort of keeps returning when I write. It's popped up in Amatka as well, with a researcher who comes to a new town and chooses a new family pretty much. And as for this, it's, during the process, I was exploring the idea of what happens when your biological family doesn't work, doesn't function, or when it isn't there, what do you do? And I thought about the absolute needs we as humans have for connection, for family, for a group, because that's what we are. We're apes who need the flock. Mm-hmm. And it's also, I suppose, some of it is self-experience in that I live far away from the rest of my family, my biological family, and so I've had to make closer connections here where I live now.
Mm-hmm.
And it's a sort of exploration of relationships or families that happen because of choice rather than circumstance.
Yeah, I think that actually, you know, it touched me on a personal level. I had my biological mother passed away when I was very young, and then I have a lot of step siblings and step family, and it is sort of a chosen thing. It was, you know, it wasn't necessary for her to decide to love me, but she did, and so I really identified with that idea of just, you know, it is chosen, but at the same time, it's not. These are just the people that ended up in circumstances together and needed to lean on each other and needed to be there for each other, and it's mm-hmm. really beautiful. Yeah, I'm also noticing that there was the magic in this book is very, I mean, fairy tale is the word that always springs to mind. There's a lot of like folklore feeling to it. Like names hold a very special significance.
Yeah.
In, you know, imparting whoever knows them with this power over the named. And I know this sort of thing shows up in a lot of folklore. You know, Rumpelstiltskin comes to mind. You know, the Scandinavian Nyx, all these, I think the Fae, right, are often really concerned with naming. Is this something, did you draw from folklore? Was it sort of all, sorry, go ahead.
Oh, I did. I grew up reading a lot of folklore, so it's sort of ingrained into me. I read all kinds of folklore, but mostly Swedish or Scandinavian folklore. So I think with this book, I returned to my roots a lot, maybe more so than I did in Amatka. So this is returning to the folklore of my homeland, pretty much. Mm-hmm. Where names are important, where you have to have good manners or the fairies will eat you. And it's Swedish folklore is, well, basically the fair folk are not nice unless you have good manners. Mm-hmm. This folklore I grew up with is pretty dark and pretty gruesome a lot of the time. And so I suppose it's those light-hearted fairy tales never really appealed much to me. So in every environment in the book, there will be some piece of me that grew up with these tales.
Yeah, there are so many. You really go into a lot of different settings as far as, you know, actually different worlds, and in each of them still there's this pervading, like it's the same sort of magical creatures and rules that you come across in various forms, but it's interesting to see them in different settings that way.
I think I've been sort of very, very interested in the rules of fairylands. And I think this may be because once upon a time, I studied comparative religion and social anthropology. And I became aware that humans really like rules. I mean, I kind of knew that before, but it became painfully apparent. Like we have rules for everything. And we especially have rules for what is and what is not proper. This thing is clean, that thing is unclean. So we categorize absolutely everything. And what we cannot categorize absolutely terrifies us. Mm-hmm. So the not quite is very, very scary.
Right. Yeah, it you know, and it's interesting too how these rules, you know, especially in the gardens where the book begins, there is a specific sort of etiquette for the masters and their servants, but it's oftentimes cruel etiquette, right? There are these rules that they follow and believe that they're being civilized, but it's not actually very civil when viewed from a different perspective.
No, absolutely. But from their point of view, it is the right way to live. It is only fit and proper for them to be masters and for the servants to be expendable. Mm-hmm.
Yeah, I mean, well, that's actually a question, because I'm meeting you today, and you don't strike me as, you seem like a very kind person and not a sociopath, but you have to put yourself you have to put yourself into the mindset of some really cruel characters in this book. I mean, how do you navigate that?
Well, I'm a role player. Mm-hmm. So, and I played role-playing games since I was a kid, since the 80s. So I've always been interested in putting myself in different mindsets, in different kinds of psychology. I've always been interested in seeing other points of view, and role-playing games is a fantastic tool for that.
Mm-hmm.
So I've always been interested in trying to put myself in the shoes of someone who is as different to me as possible.
Mm-hmm.
Which means that I am fascinated by, I suppose you could say I'm fascinated by sociopaths, because it's kind of the opposite of what I really am, I think. Or I'm sort of fascinated by that kind of thinking where other people are less worthy of being alive.
Right. There's a sort of some of the things that happen in this. There's like a casualness to the cruelty, and I think that's it's an interesting place to put a reader in, because if you're inside the head of someone who doesn't actually view certain people as people, it's almost harder to be angry with them, because it's like there's a piece of empathy missing or something, right? Like it's is their worldview is broken. But I'm making it sound like it's just a book filled with cruel people. It's not true. There's so much hope and friendship, and there's a lot of different moral codes going on. You know, there are some characters that choose their morality based on something really like grand and cosmic, and then there are some that are just kind because they react kindly. And I could probably see a lot of your role-playing experience coming through in this, because each character really feels like they have a very clear-cut motivation and morality.
I think that's probably a result of me playing so many role-playing games for such a long time, is that everything I write is very character-centered.
Mm-hmm.
It's when I write a story, it's very likely that I'll come up with a character first and then examine them to see what they might be doing. And from that, sort of just letting them walk around and see what happens. So
It's always a question I have for writers, just because some people really like to plan. So you like to sort of create your characters and then go on a journey with them, see what they do.
I am, you know how they say that writers are either plotters or pantsers?
Yeah.
Yeah, I am a pantser. And
I'm also.
So the whole thing, the way that this novel came into being is that I pantsed around for years. So I wrote 2 short stories. I wrote Augusta Prima and Aunts in 2007. Mm-hmm. And then they just lay in a folder in my computer for a while. And then I applied to Clarion in 2010, and I had to have something to apply with. So I translated Augusta Prima really quickly. Mm-hmm. And I got accepted. And Anne Vandermeer bought Augusta Prima for Weird Tales. And but then nothing much happened, because I was busy writing Jagannath and I was busy writing Amatka and then translating Amatka. But once I was done with that, I sort of started noodling around with these 2 short stories and writing some other stuff that might be maybe connected. Mm-hmm. So it was sort of like doing, it was very much a patchwork, or a Franken novel.
Mm-hmm. Oh, I like that.
A Franken novel. And so it took a very long time to edit, and I am extremely grateful both to my agent Renee and my editors Tim and Anna, because they saw what I was trying to do, and they extremely patiently and graciously helped me get there.
It's wonderful. Actually, in the fantasy genre, I know something I struggle with. When you're creating a world from scratch, there's a lot of information you need to get across to the reader. Yeah. It's like this, especially if it's something you're just thinking about all the time. You have the world very firmly fixed in your head, but you don't want to throw a lot of exposition at your reader, because they're not reading an encyclopedia. So you have to strike a balance between immersing them in the world and also meeting out information at a like digestible pace, which I think you do beautifully. Is this something that, you know, took a lot of work? Did you need feedback from readers to see like how they were responding to this world, if they felt lost at any point, or is this just like a natural thing that you're able to do?
Well, so I have a lot of information about the world. Like I have notebooks. I have a pile of notebooks, and I have an enormous amount of folders on my computer, and none of that went into the book because it's all background info. So my problem is I don't write down enough on the page. I don't show enough. So I know a lot of other writers have the problem that they keep info dumping. Mm-hmm. And that they keep going on with too much exposition or what have you. So my problem is the opposite. I actually had to struggle to get this novel as long as it was. It had to be long enough for people to be able to immerse, to understand what was going on, and to visualize the whole thing. So it's been through several rounds of reading, both by colleagues and friends and my agent and my editors. So I think my main problem here was showing more, because once I know what's in my head and I write it down, and I figured that the reader will probably be able to figure out the rest. The problem is that the reader is not in my head.
I don't think that's necessarily a problem, because there's some things that are just, that are color, that I know there's so much rich story behind that actually pulls me in. You know, you just mentioned in the very first chapter, you mentioned Porla in her pool, and it's just this casual, you know, here's this creepy woman that lives under this water. And I know there's so much more of a story behind that, but I love that it's just part of the tapestry of this world, and you're sort of wandering through seeing these oddities on the way. Is there some story that didn't go in that you would want to share with people? That
there was a bathysphere.
A bathysphere?
Yeah, a bathysphere. It's so the theatre troupe comes from that started out as a short story called The Fine Show on the Abyssal Plain, which was published in, I believe, Lightspeed. Mm-hmm. And in that story, there is a bathysphere with with the only audience that this troupe has ever had. So in the novel, I first had this troupe sort of bringing the bathysphere along with this desiccated corpse of a woman inside it, because they'd had it for, you know, hundreds of years by now. Oh my gosh. As their only audience. But I ended up having to cut it out because it didn't really make any sense anymore.
Still lovely trivia to have in my brain now that I've read this. Again, it's that delightfully, it's like charming and creepy at the same time, which is sort of the vibe of a lot of these characters.
I guess I'm a charming and creepy person.
Oh yeah, actually, I had some questions too about the names. You know, Lady Nemesine was one of the first ones that stuck out to me. And there's a lot of interesting ones.
So the lords and ladies in the gardens, and it's very difficult to talk about that without spoiling why they're actually called that. Right. And you've read the book, so you probably know.
Right.
They're named very fanciful things because it's what they think is pretty, basically. But they have a very specific background, which will become apparent to the reader if the reader has some sort of grasp of history, which they probably do. So the servants are all named after flowers, such as one of the main characters is named Thistle, which is not his real name because his real name was stolen by Augusta, who is now a fugitive in the multiverse, and Dora and Thistle are going to try to find her. And they're basically named flowers because they're not seen as humans. They're pets or functions, and you can't you can't, if you name someone after an object, it means that you don't have to see it as human anymore.
Right.
And then there's also Horby, who is a character who shows up a bit later in the book, which is a name I got from Canadian writer Amal El-Mokhtar, who I had a very long conversation with her about Jinni.
About
Jinns.
Yes, yeah.
Yeah. And I asked her some questions, and she helped me out a bit, and I asked what would be a good name for someone like that. And she got me the name Horby.
Seems like it fits really well.
Yeah. And then there's a librarian called Pinax, and Pinax is Greek. But I think if I tell you what that means, that would spoil some of the story.
Right.
Yeah. So most of these stories have deep meanings, and some of the most of the names have deep meanings, and some of the names I stole from my family, actually.
Oh, really?
Yeah. So Nils Nilsson is my great-great-grandfather. It's his name. It's not him in the book, but so I just thought it was a
great grandfather was Nils as well, since it's Nilsson.
Yep.
And so is there some of your personal history injected into that part of the book then, with, you know?
Yeah, kind of. It's I dedicated the book to my grandmother, Greta, because when I grew up, she told all these tall tales about our family. Like my great-grandfather, he only had 5 fingers all in all, because he accidentally shot 3 off, and he lost 2 fingers to a wood turner. Oh my gosh. But he didn't let that stop him. So he went on to become a very successful woodworker.
Oh, wow.
So we had stories like that, and stories like how my great-grandmother would smuggle things under her skirt between Norway and Sweden. Mm-hmm. And stories of how during the Second World War, someone found a downed parachute at the border to Norway, and they divided up the silk between them, the ladies in the village, and made clothes.
This makes sense, because it felt so it was, you felt very casually in that time period when you're writing that part of the book. It just felt like there was this intimate knowledge of like how somebody would spend their day living in this situation. Again, without giving too much away, there is some connection to the real world in this book. And it's you chose a particular time period to set it in, which I'm curious if there was a particular reasoning behind that.
So so authors don't always have a plan. I sort of returned to that time period because I think it was because I was writing about the north of Sweden, and that's where my grandmother came from. All of her stories from that time is from the 1930s and 1940s. So when I think about that part of Sweden, I'm cast back in time. Mm-hmm. And so that's probably part of it. And also, it was this sensation. I was looking for the sensation of being on the precipice of something momentous. Mm-hmm. But I think it started out with me being romantic about my grandmother's childhood, and it's sort of snowballing from there. And I do have an interest in family history, and all of my older relatives have a relationship to World War II. I grew up hearing all these stories. Like my grandfather was a medical officer on a boat that transported refugees at the end of the war. And my other grandfather was on an island that received refugees from the Baltic states during the war.
Oh, wow.
And the stories just there's an endless amount of stories about that time.
Right. So you feel like you have a personal connection to that that time. I felt like I had a little bit of a connection as well. I have some family history. I mean, my grandmother was in France, but she lived through the Holocaust, and unfortunately her parents did not, but it sort of became she needed to tell her story, and she told it a lot, you know. And so I thought about that a lot while reading this book, because there's a huge emphasis on memory and remembering, right? That remembering or not is very significant in its way. Like, if you have to hear these stories to really understand them. And I think that's very relatable for a lot of things, especially people who had family who went through things like this. How do you think memory played a role in this book? And
well, that's a good question, and no one's ever asked me that before, so you're going to have to give me a few seconds. My own memory was really bad when I wrote it, because I had burnout after Clarion. I had a severe case of burnout, so my short-term memory and my long-term memory took a hit, which I think led me to think about those things, but in a story way.
mm-hmm.
I think that's how I process everything, is through stories.
I similarly.
Yeah.
So.
Yeah.
Well, just I think it's it's one of the reasons that I really appreciate science fiction and fantasy is you know, I think there's this sort of like misconception that it's escapism, where I think that it's just a way to reframe important questions that in a way that feels more magical and less mundane, you know.
Oh yeah, it's a lens through which you can tell stories that are way more true and to the point than social realism would achieve when it comes to certain questions. And it's also a laboratory. You can you can build new societies, you can pose questions of all kinds, and you can realize these problems or solutions or what have you. You can do everything on a stage, instead of just trying to reason about it. Instead of talking about the perfect society, for example, we can just build it and see what makes it tick.
Right.
Yeah.
Yeah, it's really lovely. I noticed that there is not very much romantic love in this book. There is. It's just it's usually in the context of love lost or potential love or some, you know, it's not necessarily a driving storyline, which is honestly a refreshing change of pace. But how do you and your characters feel about love?
You know, actually, just a couple of weeks ago, this journalist asked me why I don't write sex scenes. And no one's ever asked me that before. And I was kind of stunned at the question, because why should I? I think there are so many things that are a lot more intimate than sex. And I would only include a sex scene in a book if it had bearing on the story, if it said something, if it made the story go forward. But if it doesn't, then it doesn't make sense. So, but I write a lot about love and about relationships, and I enjoy exploring all the various forms that love can take, because they are infinite. Like in the story, you have the kind of love that Dora and Thistle have for each other, which is more or less like siblings, or the love between a protector and the protected, as it were. But there is also a sort of budding romantic love between two other characters. And there's also a sort of weird, fierce, patriotic love that Augusta has for the gardens, which is also a kind of love.
Yeah, she and for her fellow masters, like, you know,
Oh yeah.
it's interesting because you can feel how strong that emotion is, despite the fact that they're just terrible people.
Yeah, they're absolutely terrible, but they're her terrible people.
Right. Yes, there's still
Yeah.
that very strong bond that she's looking to find, you know.
Mm.
Yeah, I think sorry, I'm trying to think how to phrase this.
Mm-hmm.
Go ahead if you were going to say something.
I
Sorry.
was just going to say that sounds ominous.
Oh, no. It's more that I wanted to, there was some idea, I feel like there was some queerness, despite the fact that there wasn't specifically a queer relationship. There was sort of, I don't know, I've had a feeling of that being a theme in there somehow. I may have misread though.
No, it's totally a thing. It's the way I've worked with queerness in this book is a lot about expectations of gender and people who defy expectations of gender. Like Dora, for example, she thinks of herself as a girl, but she is also probably 6'6" and muscular and just basically enormous and strong and terrifying, while her brother Thistle is sort of kind of small and delicate and sort of more romantic and kind than he is stereotypically masculine. And I've sort of enjoyed having them around to explore how because queerness isn't just about relationships, it's also about how you relate to the world, how
Right.
you relate to society's expectations of who you should be, because you were assigned a specific gender at birth.
Right.
So yeah, and I guess like in Amatka, I didn't make it a big deal, and it's not really a big deal here either. It's not.
But it is the thing that I'm really noticing, especially in a fairy tale setting. In a lot of classic fairy tales, you know, the women are being rescued and the men are doing the rescuing, and you have just different pillars of strength in different ways, right? It's not even to say that Thistle is not a pillar of strength. He's just is in a different way. Not assigning value to physical strength or how emotions are displayed. You just do a really good job of creating complex people outside of their gender.
Thank you. And of course there's the suave non-binary peanuts in there as well.
Yes, very suave. And there is sort of an equal mixture of masculine and feminine qualities to them as well. And some that are just genderless, which again, I'm assigning value to that even by phrasing it that way. But
I think it's very difficult to get away from the fact that we assign gender to almost everything, including, especially qualities. Like if someone is kind-hearted, or if they're strong, or if they're fierce or weak or what have you, we will assign them to either of the binaries, which is what we do. Circling back to what I said at the beginning about people in categories, it's what we do.
Right. Yes, we do have a tendency to want to just put people into particular things, like what describe them, how they in particular ways.
Yeah, and we get super nervous with people who sort of defy expectations of what gender we think they should belong to.
Right. Yeah. I think the book I'm thinking of is The Left Hand of Darkness. There's Gwyn. book where they delve a lot into gender, and especially it was like, revolutionary at the time. I think it was written in the 50s, 60s, something like that.
1969, I think.
Oh, you've got it down.
No, I've done lectures on the Gwyn, and I wrote the foreword for the Swedish translation of The Dispossessed.
Oh wow, wonderful.
Yeah. So she's one of my. I'm a huge fan.
Wonderful. I mean, the reason I brought her up is because of that. It felt a similar way of dealing with gender, in the sense that, you have to sort of acknowledge the societal things that people try to put on people in order to subvert them. So, yeah. Did you? I mean, I guess this is a broad question, and it's kind of for me because I'm curious. Did you have a favorite character? I know that's like a vague question, because a character can be great because they're fun to write, and a character can be someone that you love, like a child or a sibling. And I know it's a different thing, but
well, I love all my children, but Augusta is just so absolutely over the top, mustache twirlingly evil in her way.
Dastardly, for sure.
She is absolutely dastardly, and yet she is not. She has her own she has her own motives, and she has her own inner logic, and she has her own weaknesses as well. There are things she loves. I just thought it was so fascinating to go into her mindset again, because I've been there before. It was so fascinating to go into a world and sort of figure out how to make her a relatable character, even though she is obviously an absolute villain.
I think some of her interaction with Pinax was helpful in that, because I think that was the most humanized that I felt she was.
Yeah, it's when she sort of tries to, she makes an attempt at being civilized and good. Yeah.
Right, and then expects, immediate compensation for it.
Exactly. But I also love Dora so much. I love
my favorite.
She's a favorite, and I love that she's she's a girl. She's an enormous, really strong girl she's not too quick, but she has a great deal of love, and she's fiercely protective of Thistle, and she's a bit of a Dr. Watson character now that I think about it.
Yeah, go expound on that.
No, I think it was more obvious in earlier drafts, where Thistle is the one who's on a quest.
Right, he has the plan.
He has the plan. Dora is the muscle. And I sort of think about her as someone who tells the story of Thistle's adventures, and then just sort of slowly it becomes her own story as well.
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah.
She is described a lot as slow, but slow in the sense of just, it's like she lives on a different timeline than everybody else,
Yeah, she does.
And I could see that sort of translating emotionally into constancy, right? It's just, Thistle sort of knows that she's always going to be there, like a mountain, like she just.
Oh yeah, she's going to be there, and she's going to be there for a long time, because she operates on a completely different time scale. Yeah.
You brought up before that you had written, you wrote this book in English, and you had written some of the short stories in Swedish first before translating them.
Yeah.
Do you feel your writing style changes depending on what language you're writing in? Do you have a thing you prefer to write in Swedish or English, or?
So it used to be more apparent, or it used to be very different, but I think that my styles have sort of merged now in Swedish and English. It used to be that my Swedish was very sort of extremely spare, and my English was more, I think, for lack of a better word, floral. But then as I worked on both languages, I've sort of, the spare and the floral have sort of merged into the language I use today. So if I could choose, I would choose to write in Swedish, but the way things look, I can't really sell stuff in Sweden anymore, or I never could. My books just never made it in Sweden. So I made it.
Much of a market for science fiction and fantasy there, or?
No, the thing is that there are a lot of readers. There just isn't a lot of publication of Swedish fantasy or science fiction, and this is because way back when there used to be a fair bit of translation into Swedish, like science fiction novels and fantasy novels and what have you. But the big publishers were too slow. So the readers started buying the books in English because they didn't want to wait for the translation. So what you have now is that you have a fairly big readership, but they're all reading the originals. So there's no money in translating the books, which sort of means it also means that it's difficult to publish science fiction and fantasy in Swedish, because there's also a general, publishers aren't very good at fantastic fiction.
How so?
As in, when I started shopping my stories around, my first short story collection, I would get rejections that said stuff like, "We don't know what to do with this genre." Yeah. So "We don't publish your genre." And I would get that from all the big publishing houses. Then eventually I managed to publish Amatka with a big one, but it was a science fiction imprint. And it didn't sell.
Oh my goodness.
Yeah. So the fact that I write in English is I started writing in English out of pure rage, because I wanted my stuff to be read by someone, and it wasn't happening in Sweden. So I figured I might as well switch languages.
I mean, the writing is fantastic. So I can understand having more comfort writing in Swedish for you, but it doesn't come across. So it's just.
Thank you.
I really love. You were talking about it like it was a problem before, that you have this you don't include a lot of detail. I think you include just enough, because it's I like the way that action drives forward, that you have enough of a taste of the world to know where you are, but you're not just caught up in settings. It's like things are moving and there's a lot of mystery. It's really lovely.
I'm glad. Thank you.
Is there something that I haven't asked about that you wanted to discuss about the book?
I don't know. We've touched on all the good bits, I think.
Is there something of your own life or experience that you think was injected into any of the characters or plot, or?
Well, the thing is that when you write a book, everything you're experiencing, as in reading, watching, stuff happening in your life, it goes into the book, whether it is on a conscious or a subconscious level. So any book any author writes is sort of
it's impossible not to write your own.
It's impossible not to write. Thank you. It's impossible not to write your own life into a book. But the question is, on what level? And I sort of, it seeps in. But it would be very difficult for me after 2 years of editing this. It would be very difficult for me to say, to point to a page and say, that's when I lived back on that address and I had croissants for breakfast every morning.
Right.
Which I didn't, but you know.
Yeah, I know that you were thinking about doing a reading for us today as well. I don't know how are we looking on time?
I have no idea what time it is, to be honest. I have a small passage I could read, if you like.
I would love to hear that. I'm sure everyone else would as well.
Okay. I've talked so much now, so my voice is a bit weak, but you have to bear with me. So this is chapter 2. Hidden behind an oak at the edge of the game lawn, Dora watched them play. She kept a veil drawn over her face. The pale lords and ladies loitered on the grass, leaning on croquet clubs and each other. Lady Mnemosyne watched from her seat on the podium, eyes shadowed under her wreath, her skirt spread out like a willow tree. Walpurgis lay on the grass at her feet, propped up on his elbow. The left half of his white coat was spattered with something sticky looking. Next to him, the twins Cymbeline and Virgilia embraced on their divan. Cymbeline's crinoline was covered in chestnut leaves. Virgilia's dress was woven out of peacock feathers. At the edge of the lawn, Augusta's sister, Euterpe, was already drunk, rolling around in the grass, dressed only in a thin shift. Hyssop, Virgilia's page boy, stood at attention nearby, holding a tray of drinks and sweetmeats. Like the other servants, he was good at not moving. Moving drew attention. In the center of the lawn, surrounded by little arches stuck into the ground, the Lady Augusta stared at a striped ball by her feet. She looked formidable in a brilliant blue coat and neat knee pants. Her mahogany hair was freshly curled, her face a work of art. Thistle stood at her elbow, hands clasped behind his back, eyes wandering over the lawn. He looked into the trees and briefly met Dora's gaze. His eyes widened a fraction, and he shook his head almost imperceptibly. Augusta swung her club. The ball flew in a high arc and hit Hyssop. He had dropped his tray and clutched his arm with a groan. The crowd on the lawn burst into cheers and applause. Mnemosyne smiled and nodded from her podium. When Hyssop straightened, Virgilia got up from the divan and slapped him. She pointed at the mess. Hyssop immediately kneeled to pick it up, his left arm shaking. Dora watched as the game progressed. She had never understood the rules, but everyone broke into applause when the players hit the servants. Augusta swung her club with flair. Thistle had to duck several times to avoid getting smacked. He fetched drinks when asked to and mopped the sweat from Augusta's brow with a small handkerchief. Dora almost ran out across the lawn when Lord Tempestus landed his ball in the face of Euterpe's little page, Calla, but she knew she mustn't. It would make things worse. Calla bled all over her doublet and spat something into her hand. At cake break, they punished Hyssop for dropping the tray. Virgilia took his jacket and shirt off. 2 flower stems reached up along Hyssop's shoulder blades, and more of them meandered down his arms. Each servant had their special art, carved into them with teeth and nails. Hyssop, Calla, Vetch, Foxglove, others, and Thistle. Walpurgis and Cymbeline took each of Hyssop's arms. Virgilia sank one of her long fingernails into her page's right shoulder. Dora forced herself to watch. Hyssop deserved her bearing witness at least. She had barged in once to defend the page. The lords and ladies had reacted quickly. They wouldn't strike her like they would a servant. Instead, they had immobilized her with their words, but not before Dora had knocked Cymbeline to the ground and made her cry. And for Dora's rebellion, they had hurt Thistle. Eventually, Virgilia stepped back and licked at her bloodied hand. Dora lost sight of Hyssop as the other nobles crowded in to inspect Virgilia's work and mumble their appreciation. "His pattern is done," Walpurgis announced over the murmur. "A hunt," Virgilia shouted. "I call for a hunt." "Excellent," Mnemosyne said from her throne. "We shall have a hunt when this game is complete. Come here, little Hyssop, and sit at my feet." Hyssop shambled over to the dais and sank down on his knees. Dora could see his face now, twisted and tearful. He knew what awaited him. So did Dora. And there was nothing she could do. Hyssop was all grown up, and his flower was finished, and so he must die.
Lovely. I mean, darkly lovely.
Yeah.
Are you ready for some questions from the audience?
Sure.
All right. So this one comes from Sophia. She would love to hear you talk about which character, if any, was the most unruly while writing him or her.
Unruly. I think probably Horby, because she was unruly in the way that I had trouble understanding what she wanted. She went off on adventures, she had opinions, and she had an agenda, but she was very reluctant to reveal it for a long time. So I had to sit down and have a good talk with her. Yeah.
Here's a question from Ruth. I gather your experience from Clarion was a bit mixed. What would you say to anyone thinking of applying to this kind of intensive writing course?
Well, for me, Clarion is the single best thing I have done for my career. I have to say that it was an absolute game changer and it changed my life. So I think it's, I know it's not like that for everyone, but for me it was tremendously important. But I also think it's very important to go into that knowing that it will be a horrendous amount of work. And that, if possible, take some time off after. Just give yourself the time to recuperate.
Okay, this is a question from Christina. She is wondering if Augusta is a little Machiavellian or a lot.
I think Augusta is on the a lot side. Definitely, yes.
Here's one from Alva. What significance is written into the landscape of the story? Like or unlike the role landscape, so obviously played in Amatka? And how do you relate to landscapes and the cultural natural geography in your stories? And what details do you choose to tell?
I like writing about smell. Landscape is tremendously important. But when I write about it, what I do like to imagine is smells and textures, not just what the trees look like around you in the gardens, for example, but what smells can you feel? What's the bark on a tree like to touch? Something like that.
Okay. And here's a question from Lena. She's wondering which novels and writers have inspired you. I know you mentioned some already, but
this is a really hard one. It always is, because I read a lot and I watch a lot of films and TV series and art shows, and I listen to music. So it's very difficult to say where my inspiration comes from. It's just, I'd like to describe it as my mind being a sort of compost heap. So everything that happens, everything I read and write and watch, it all goes onto the compost heap. And then it sort of ferments and it turns to mulch. And I sort of pick up the juice that seeps out from the bottom. Like sometimes when you have a trash bag and there's a hole in it. So basically what I write is garbage juice, just so I have it said.
Sorry, I'm laughing. That looks it for the questions. I just put a link towards purchasing the book, which I highly recommend. It helps support everybody involved with the book, so please do look at that. Is there any other questions before we wrap it up for today? Oh, Christina is asking, do you like audiobooks or would you prefer people to read the book?
As far as I know, it's a really good audiobook recording. So if you like to listen to books, the parts of it that I've heard are really well done.
Okay.
Yeah.
Okay. Well, thank you so much, Karin, and thank you so much, Sara, for leading the discussion. It was a wonderful. It was wonderful to listen to both of you talk. A copy of this talk will be on our website in probably a day or two. So if you know someone who missed it, we'll have a copy of the video there and on our YouTube page. So we have a lot of interesting things coming up at Scandinavia House. We have a panel on radicalism in the northern countries on Thursday. And on Saturday, we are celebrating the esteemed American-Estonian architect Louis Kahn, who celebrates his 120th birthday with another book talk. So please do visit the website, scandinavias.org, for everything that we have to offer. And we hope to see everyone again soon. Thank you again for attending.